I forgot to mention earlier the University of Calgary. Thank you for co-hosting with Mount Royal University. Got a little swept up there. Based on previous feedback from previous conferences, people wanted to hear more about the Society. What is the Society? Who are the people representing the Society? So you just heard some of that. But now let's get to the headlining event. First, some facts, and then let me talk about Gary very briefly. Gary Poole is Professor Emeritus in the School of Population and Public Health in the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine. From 2000 to 2010, he was director of the Center for Teaching and Academic Growth and the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at UBC. He was president of ISSOTL, we think, in 2010. He has earned a 3M Teaching Fellowship and a Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal for contributions to higher education. He's also co-founding editor with me of Teaching and Learning Inquiry, one of my favorite colleagues and friends in the world, someone I learn from all the time. Has published recently interesting work on the role of small significant networks in the spread of SOTL. Has a really good article on doing SOTL ethically, and is the author of a chapter that I think everyone who gets involved in SOTL should absolutely read. It's called Square One, What is Research? It's in Kathleen McKinney's book. I think that is one of the most important pieces written in the field and about the field. But enough of all this. Gary Poole.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you for coming. I feel like I belong, which is an important thing. It comes and goes, that feeling. I don't know if it does for you, but this sense of feeling like you belong to something is going to be a running theme for the time that you and I spend together in this session, and I don't think anything could have happened prior to this presentation that would have set up what I want us to think about any better than what we just heard. So thank you. Thank you for all of those words that made us think about so many important things. Oh dear. I feel at once, I need to tell you, famous and under interrogation. As I said to Nicola before, if those are the headlights, I'm the deer. We'll see how we do today. This notion of belonging, you can tell from Pat's comments as she talked about some of the important milestones of our society, is a very, very important value for us. And I want to talk about that. I want us to talk about that and look at that over the next 45 minutes or so. But I am not going to have us spend our time, as tempted as I am to do so, to just engage in a kind of 1 hour ISSOTL group hug. I've had those hugs literally and figuratively. I'm telling you, they change your life. They're great, but that's not what I want us to look at today. I want us to look at, perhaps macroscopically on some levels and very microscopically on others, some in-the-moment things that happen as we talk to one another that bring about that kind of belonging or that get in the way of it in ways that are problematic and worrisome. So we'll see how we go with that. I think, by the way, that every single issue in the scholarship of teaching and learning can be traced back to the field's diversity. everything, whether it be this discussion of research methods. Nancy alluded to the chapter that it was one of the great invitations of my career from Kathleen McKinney to be part of that book. Even just agreeing on what's viable and acceptable research is a challenge for us because of the diversity we all bring to this enterprise. In fact, the very definition of SOTL itself continues to be, well, let's call it a fun topic. It's also a potentially very frustrating one, but it is nevertheless that diversity that drives us. And I think when we ask that question, who gets to reach? Or as I sometimes shorten it to, so who's in? Who's in? That question is informed by, problematized by, challenged by, made fascinating by our diversity. So let's hold that as one of the themes that drives this exploration of the question, who gets to reach? I think that question, by the way, is going to be relevant for us forever. This isn't a fad thing. This started with some very interesting conversations and metaphors back in 2004, and it's still with us here in 2017, and I think it's going to stick forever, and I love that. I love the idea that we are going to continue to debate what research is. Who else is going to do it? Well, other people perhaps. But many of the disciplines that you and I belong to outside of SOTL think they've figured that out already. I like it that we don't. Some of you have heard me talk about that in other venues. So I think a discussion of who's in, are we doing that right? Is this actually research? These are wonderful, healthy conversations. I work at a place called the Center for Health Education Scholarship at UBC. One of the people who works there is a faculty member named Laura Simmons. And Laura put me onto an article that looked at the interview methods in qualitative research, making the point that in interviews, we don't collect data, we create it. Oh, Laura, I said, I had that all figured out. You know, I'd spent years doing one-way ANOVAs, two-way ANOVAs, and yes, three-way ANOVAs. And then linear regression and chi-square. And then I started to do interviews and I thought, okay, now I'm multilingual. And she said, well, actually, when you interview someone, the process of interviewing them creates the story. It creates situations in which they remember some things and forget others, tell some things to you in some ways that they would not tell others, and so it goes, and you're creating data, and now I had to sit down and take a rest. So the challenging of our methods, the expanding of our methods is a huge strength for us, but only if we can also continue to ask and answer the question, who's in? Okay. Now, you're in. You're in. Now, not forever if you don't want, you know. This city has an airport, roads, it'll probably need plowing, but roads, so you can go. But for now, in this moment, let's say you're in. Some of you really in. Like up to here in. And I'm just very interested in how that happened. So we're going to make some good noise. For reasons that I actually can't even explain to myself, I am now teaching a large third-year psychology class. I've got 200 students, and I'm regularly putting them to discussions in the classroom. And I've decided one way to actually get them kick-started is, all right, make some good noise. I'm saying that now on Tuesday mornings. So now I'm saying it here. All right, I want you to make some good noise. And I want you to make it by considering and just talking to one another about the following 2 questions. Under the general heading of, who got you into this? What are the settings? What were they back then when you first started talking about this field? And what was said? There's a chance that some of you have actually not had any of these conversations. You just woke up one day, I don't know how it happened. You were walking along a street somewhere in southern Ontario and boom, whoa, I've got to do SOTL. Probably not, however. Probably there was some degree of conversation, and I want you to take just a couple of minutes. We're going to make like 3 minutes of good noise. Talk to people around you. If you can remember who got you in, where was it, what was said. Go. Okay, folks, I'm going to bring us back together. Can we come back together as one group? Oh, maybe not. Okay, there we go. Thanks. Thanks, Greg. Can we come back together as one group? Maybe I shouldn't put that as a question. The answer could be no, we can't. No. Okay. Well, it would be interesting to talk at some length about the people you were talking about. Maybe you were talking to the very person who was the person you had that first conversation with, or maybe not. Maybe you haven't talked to that person for a long time, and that would be a good little resolution for us all, to find some of these folks and say, you got me into this, in the best of all possible ways. Well, that's a very brief look at the very early stages of our own personal journeys. Those journeys have become, for me, very, very interesting. And I'd like to explore them as I'm exploring them now in some of my work with a lot of other people from an institutional perspective, and also the psychologist in me can't help it, an interpersonal perspective. So how do these journeys get started? How do they get supported? And all of that helps us understand, and so who's in? How did that happen? Are we doing that right? Are we answering the question, who's in the right ways? And are we making our invitations in ways that are healthy and supportive and good for this field, in the ways that some folks before me just on this stage talked about? In 2013, a bunch of us published a paper with Andrea Williams from the University of Toronto as the first author, based on an international collaborative writing project back then that was held when ISSOTL was at McMaster. And we were looking at how the scholarship of teaching and learning, the word we used was, gets woven into an institutional culture. And we decided that a way to understand that was to divide any given institution onto 3 levels, simple levels: a micro level, a meso level, and a macro level. Now, I tried this sometime around 3 o'clock this afternoon without falling off the stage. We'll see if we can still do this. Come on. Oh, there it is. It was way over there on the wall. Anyway, we'll start at the meso level for a second. Oh, and by the way, in the spirit of inclusivity, one of the things that Katarina and one of her research partners, Torgny Roksa, talked about that really caught our attention a few years ago was the notion of something they called local leadership. Perhaps it caught our attention because a number of us were actually trying to take on those roles. We were either assigned them and being paid under the assumption that we actually were being local leaders, or somehow it just happened. But one way or the other, it became really interesting for us to try to figure out what we could do to support the scholarship of teaching and learning at a grassroots level. And so those folks working at that meso level perhaps were our first entry point into understanding some of the possibilities. We knew that there was a scholarship of teaching and learning work being done at that microscopic level, sometimes by individuals, sometimes by groups, but we also believed that it would die on the vine without some degree of good meso-level local leadership. Leadership that both understood what SOTL was about and what its potential was, and how to support it, which means they actually knew who was doing it. Whew, what a thought. So they got to know their people. Similarly, if you take it up to the macro level, you see people working at a big picture level. We can do SOTL at universities where our senior administration neither cares nor knows, but it's nowhere near as impactful, nowhere near as rewarding as when they do and they get it. I would argue, without putting institutions on the spot, that our host institutions are in that category. They have people at senior levels who get it, who see themselves as supporters of, fosterers of the work we've come here to talk about over the next few days. So those are the important levels, but it was at the micro level that Rosalind Verwood, Isabeau Iqbal, and I really started to get interested in what's going on in those nifty little groups of people we're so proud to have created with, I don't know, images from some Google thing. What's going on there? That really interested us. We wanted to know at first, what are these folks thinking? What do they believe? And now I've become very interested in what they're saying. So we go from that microscopic level. Some of you have seen drawings like this from social network analysis, again, inspired very much by Torgny and Katarina's work and others. The idea that while large communities of practice are inspirational and in some cases powerful and politically expedient, a lot of the rolled up sleeve work gets done in small groups that meet perhaps serendipitously. Perhaps because their offices are on the same floor, the same hallway. Perhaps they do photocopying at the same time, if there's anybody who still does photocopying. Whatever the reason, they began having important conversations. Some of you perhaps last year were at a workshop that Rosalind and I ran, ISSOTL was in Vancouver, taking part by a distance, where we asked people to draw up these maps. So that person at the top of the triangle, that might be the individual in question, and that person's identified 2 other people with whom they have the majority of their conversations about the scholarship of teaching and learning. They've drawn a circle around one of them to identify the person who provides the most impact in those conversations. Impact could be positive or negative. We didn't stipulate. We asked them to adjust the thickness of the line to indicate how frequently they spoke with those people compared to other people in their network. We also asked them to tell us how much value they perceived in each of those dyadic relationships. And we asked them how much similarity they perceived between themselves and each of the other people in the network. Rosalind and I are going to talk about this at a session on Friday, so I won't scoop it. But it becomes really interesting when you think about, okay, what do you believe? What are you thinking when you form these groups? And then the question becomes, and what are you talking about? That's where I want us to focus more of our attention today. What might be the substance of some of the conversations within the networks? That's what I asked you to talk about for just 3 minutes when we started. How do conversations within these networks facilitate or hinder our journeys? Which is another way of saying, how do these conversations let people in or keep people out? I'm not saying that academics naturally have a tendency to want to keep some people out, but maybe some of us have felt that way over the years. I think much of the conversation that facilitates or hinders our journeys happens almost without our conscious awareness, not realizing the extent to which we are doing this, facilitating or hindering. What do I mean by facilitate and hinder? Well, I'll just give you 3 words, and then it's going to be another chance to make a bit of noise. Facilitative conversations motivate, they educate, and they include. Just thinking about those 3 words only. They motivate, they educate, they include. Hindering conversations, of course, discourage, confuse, and exclude. With that in mind, now, back to the noise for these questions. Thinking back to the conversations you have had, what's one characteristic for you of a facilitating conversation? What's one characteristic of a hindering conversation? If you've never had a conversation that hinders you, write the book now. Okay, another quick 3-minute bit of good noise, if you will. Away you go. Okay, can we come back? Can we come back together? This. Okay, here we are. Sorry. Yeah, I said, can we come back together as one group? And Torgny said, no. I put a bit of Swedish accent in it. Did you notice? I tried anyway. Thank you. Very good. Well, he's so kind. He's very kind. Oh, dear me. Okay. Yeah, if you're doing the closing plenary and you put people to work, by the end of the last day here, you never get their attention again, because the group just knits and knits and knits. It's wonderful to be part of. There are 6 sections of seats in this hall. Each one has 120 seats in it for a total of 600. Yeah, I had time on my hands this afternoon. So over in this section here, would someone just holler out a phrase that you heard that somehow might characterize a facilitating conversation? Holler it out. Pardon me? Openness. Ah, thank you. Well, the second group here gets a characteristic of a hindering conversation. Can you give us one of those? Done that before. Okay, this is good. Facilitate? Time and given. Ah, yes. Oh, yeah. It's amazing how often that gets discussed. Hinder? Resources, yeah. It's a good idea, Gary. Don't get me wrong. But realistically, and can you give us one more facilitator on the end? Energy. Neat. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, well, we could just keep going back and forth for the rest of the session. But I thought about this as well, and I thought, okay, when I've asked people about this sorts of things, in addition to the ones you gave, facilitating conversations do these things. They show interest. Tell me more. I have a friend who uses that paralinguistic, as it's called, so beautifully. I just love it. And now he and I also use it sometimes when a third person says something that completely puzzles us or makes us think, you gotta be joking. And I look at him and say, Anyways, asks useful questions. How does that manifest itself in your classroom? How does that idea you're talking about manifest itself in the way you plan what you want your students to do? How does that idea get energized in you? That's a great Dan Pratt question for those of you who know my colleague from UBC. And sometimes I don't have an answer and you feel like a real idiot. You know? That's a good idea. How does it get energized in you? Well, I told you, Dan. But of course you go away and think about it more. Offering fresh perspectives. Have you thought about, and a great favorite, especially in light of the notion of time, encouraging further work. You've got nothing else to do. Why don't you take on a second layer of this? People in Europe would be interested to join as colleagues. They've got nothing to do either. Well, then there's the hindrance side, which is, of course, kind of just times -1. Hindering conversations are dismissive. They focus on weaknesses. They truncate a topic. They send messages regarding, this is one of my personal favorites, misappropriation of priorities. Are you sure this is what you should be spending your time on now? Well, no, I could go for a walk. I want to take a quick look a little closer at this question that I think we need to ask ourselves now. Am I a source of facilitative conversations in SOTL? Of course we are most of the time. Why spend the time and money and energy and effort to come to a conference if we don't believe that's who we are? Of course you are. But we get tired, we get fed up, we run out of time. And yeah, we do hear the same idea more than once. And it might just slip out, starting with the word like, look. Interestingly, in other parts of the world, that word does not have the same sort of negative look out connotation that it has in North America. If someone in North America says back to you, look, or better, listen. They don't mean look and listen. They mean shut up and go away. Yet other parts of the world, those phrases don't mean that, but around here they tend to. I want to say a word or two about something called Unit 7. The Centre for Health Education Scholarship partners with the University of Western Ontario and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And through Maastricht, where the degree is housed, people can pursue a Master's of Health Professions education. The people who pursue these degrees, for the most part, are medical doctors who are finishing their residencies because they don't have anything else to do either. Enormously busy people with pressures up to here wake up one morning and say, I think I need a master's degree in education. And the system is better because they do. So they take a master's degree, a series of units on educational principles, on the scholarship of teaching and learning, on research methods, and they have to do a thesis. And Unit 7 is one that Dan Pratt and I, for a number of years, oversaw at UBC. We meet 3 times, and in 3 weeks, they present a first, a second, and a third draft of a research proposal for a master's degree. Man, you talk about me looking like a deer in headlights. These remarkably competent people are literally shaking as they hold pieces of paper and give presentations on their work each week. They're new to the field. They know they're smart, but they know they're in a room with very smart people. They have no idea how they're going to get it done, and maybe one night about 2 a.m. they think, what was I thinking? Like, what was wrong with obstetrics? So they come in uncharacteristically worried, nervous. Their ideas are not well formed yet. They shouldn't be. And Pratt and I have the job of telling them that. I want to suggest to you, as Dan and I believe, it's one of the greatest privileges we've ever had in our working lives to tell people their ideas aren't well formed yet. Doing it in ways that don't discourage them, because it's unrealistic to think anything else of their ideas at that point. So Unit 7, for me, is a microcosm of the conversations we have with one another about our nascent ideas, about the things that we are continually working on, that we find difficult. Because it would be a mistake if Dan decided, or I decided, we'll have a Unit 7 group hug. You people are fine. It'll be great. I know your sample size is absurd. I know the first 3 questions that you've put in your interview will probably cause half of the people to get up and walk out of the room, but still, you're a delightful person and we're happy you're here. And by the way, these folks have a very, very sensitive antenna for patronization. So, Dan and I have a ton of work to do. In this case, working with learners, with students. Maybe one reason why we're so keen on student partnerships in this society is that conversations with them help us have facilitative conversations, and they help us get better at it. Well, the other question becomes facilitating what? It's good fun, I think, just sort of facilitate friendship. There's nothing wrong with that. The world could use more of it. But what exactly? Well, venting, we can facilitate that. A colleague comes up and says, "Oh man, students, Gary, crap." And I say back, "Oh, yeah. There, a facilitating conversation, empathic, but of course getting nowhere. One that may just reinforce the status quo." The work, without going into it in detail, the work that Rosalind and Isabel and I have been doing indicates that we seek out people who we perceive to be similar to us to have these kinds of conversations. That doesn't come as a surprise, but the strength of it is surprising. And when we seek out those people, there's a chance that they'll just say, "Yeah, Gary, yeah, what can you do? Like, what can you do? Get on with the things in your life you can do something about." And those students, those incredibly entitled students who want extensions on everything, never mind them. But if we show interest, ask useful questions, offer fresh perspectives, and encourage further work, we actually undermine venting for its own sake. We challenge the status quo. We're facilitating, but we are not facilitating mediocrity. This is where it becomes way more than a group hug. For Nancy and for me, as we'll look at in a moment, the decisions that we make as co-editors of Teaching and Learning Inquiry need to go way beyond just facilitating an inclusion. We need to be able to say to the students in Unit 7, that interview won't fly. That interview has unethical questions in it. People won't understand question number 3. It's full of medical jargon, whatever it might be. We have to be able to say that. And we still think we're facilitating something. So let's look at some more formal conversations in the form of peer review. Some of you will know that Nancy and Galicia Blackman and I from here in Calgary have been looking at a large, randomly selected sample of peer reviews from Teaching and Learning Inquiry and doing qualitative analysis of those reviews in terms of content, what's common content, and tone. There are themes that come up in almost every review of a SOTL submission. The literature review, it's not complete. Research methods, they're weak in places, maybe a lot of places. And the contribution to the field is unclear. I'll tell you what's interesting about those 3 points. I think you can say that about every piece ever written. So the question isn't, okay, are we guilty of these flaws? We are. We are. The question is, how do we communicate that and work on it? That's the key question. How do we push ourselves for more complete understanding of the literature, a better application of the right research methods, if that's what we were up to, or a clearer articulation of something complex, which research can do for us, whether we're collecting data or whether we are observing concepts and applying them. And how do we articulate how we think this is contributing to the field? So how are these topics talked about? For the most part, the reviews that we read in Teaching and Learning Inquiry, and this is a phrase I think I've just stolen directly from Nancy, because you just use verbs I don't use, Nancy, that's all there is to it. Foregrounding a message of mentorship or evaluation. You've got that, you seem to have that choice. Yes, your review must include evaluation, that's part of the deal, but what do you foreground? What tone do you set in order to send those important messages? And in our experience, a mentoring voice prevails. And we, for those of you who provide those reviews, and by the way, for those of you who don't, we'll talk. Thank you. Thank you. You facilitate the field, you push the field. And what we end up with are facilitative messages that do those things. Often beginning by articulating strengths, acknowledging the work that was expended to get where they are, identifying the concerns, suggesting options, expressing optimism, motivating. None of this is about dumbing down. This is about pushing us to higher levels. Thank you. Facilitative work uses formative language. And again, it's a lot of our reviews are a treat to read. So please don't read into this that I'm thinking, hey, we got a problem to fix here, folks. That's not the point. I think we're good at this. We need to keep getting even better at it. But, you know, okay, those are the reviews that bring people in, even though they may result in a ton of extra work, but it brings them in. Well, but not all do. Some are dismissive, some focus on weaknesses, some truncate the topic, just like we were talking about before. Some say, this project is of limited use. The author needs to go back to the drawing board and start over. The author's time could have been better spent just teaching the course. Right. And in this way, we decrease the number of people who reach. There you go. So we ended up with this notion, and again, Nancy, I think this is your term. It reads like your term. It's Kalisha. Oh my goodness. Is she here? Are you here? Kalisha, are you here? Oh, hello. Oh, there you are. Okay. This is Galisha's term. I'll work my way out of this by saying that the hallmark of a good team is no one really knows where the idea came from. And I think we have been a good team. But Galisha then talks about the invested reviewer. And that list reads like a facilitative list. And just like the presence of these things is important, the absence of things like abrasive tone, blunt statements, and an inability to provide recommendations. Watch when you get tired and you write a review that said, this paper just doesn't hold together for me. End of that particular critique. Some of us, I have received reviews like that. What are you going to do with that? Here, let me hold it for you. And I do believe it comes from just the amount of work we take on and how at times it is frustrating to read things that fall apart for you as a reader. They do. It's not simple. So I'm not about to say we have some degree of cruelty in our midst, but as an ideal to move toward, facilitative peer review, facilitative individual conversations, facilitative work with our students. Well, it's an ideal. That means we never actually get there, so we can never stop reaching. And if it's an ideal, maybe it moves toward an ideology. This is where I really have fun because I'm going to sound like a sociologist and I don't have a clue. So for the sociologists in our group, my apologies, but here we go anyway. So according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, an ideology, a manner or the content of thinking characterized by an individual, group, or culture, And an organization's chosen or espoused isms. Okay? Whew, very nice. Well, according to Poole, an ideology is a set of big ideas an organization lives by. The big tent, for example, is one such ideology. So, the last thing that I'll put to you this evening is the rather audacious notion that what we're talking about here is a key part of SOTL ideology. It's about facilitation of participation and rigor. This is not simple. We can never stop asking ourselves, who gets to reach? And how effectively can we reach? I think this makes this one of the most challenging academic, intellectual pursuits I've ever seen. And I'm thrilled to be part of it. So I gave it a name. Constructive inclusion. Ism. So the invitation, if you want to take it up, is pretty clear. And we've just got the perfect opportunity to continue it for the next few days. To facilitate the way you talked about facilitating. And to push, because that's part of what facilitation is. Maybe we're all kind of in Unit 7. Sounds a little intergalactic. Thank you. Nancy and I communicate in hand signals now. It's fantastic. You know, when I can get someone from the discipline of English to communicate in hand signals, I know I've really gotten somewhere. Soon you'll get me communicating with words. We have a few minutes, and we have some roving mics, I think. Greg and others, the crew that's been looking after all of the sights and sounds. I don't know if you have any questions or comments. We've got a few minutes for that. Great. I can't see hands worth a darn. Can somebody help me with that? Who's maybe somebody carrying a mic? Okay, that's great. Thank you, Mayor.
So I just wanted to know if you could come back to the theme that you started with, belonging.
Yes.
And how does that relate to facilitation as one of the primary activities we're engaged in?
Yes, yeah. Well, the social psychologist in me believes... Oh, I'm sorry. Of course you didn't. I did. I've been invited to go back to the original theme of belonging and how that might relate to facilitation. Thank you for that question. My disciplinary bias before I jumped in with both feet to SOTL was social psychology. Some of you know that. And so you won't be surprised to hear that I think that, sort of like Abraham Maslow once said, a fundamental need is belonging. You don't satisfy that, you don't get really interested in some of the higher ones. If you don't sense that you can belong to a field, why on earth would you choose to put in the remarkable amount of time required to contribute to it? So I see belonging as a necessary, but not sufficient, important frame for us to have in our heads before we can carry on. We're not the only society and not the only conference that deliberately works on belonging, that invites people to special sessions if it's your first ISSOTL conference. Other people, other groups are doing that. But let's never trivialize the value of that. That's not just a nifty little social gathering. And neither is it purely a cynical strategic move to increase membership. We don't do that. We're done. We're done. So thank you for reminding me to go back to the beginning. If I ever give this talk again, I'll do that. Any others? Please. This is a little tough for me, so go ahead.
Okay. So I come from University of Calgary. I have a question about ideology, because if a SOTL person needs to be inclusive and facilitate participation, and if that person is coming actually from the science background, so like I am, and actually when I do read peer review, I never see an inclusive language. And this is pretty much the culture. And I don't see, like, with time, I don't see this as like being impolite or exclusive, but that's how science is reviewed. So if you could speak about how should identity be changed to be able to do SOTL and to review SOTL research.
Right, thank you. You okay with that? Could you hear that all over the hall? Okay. So yeah, how do we compare to other disciplines? I have a 3.5-year-old grandson who, believe it or not, is playing organized soccer on Wednesday nights, because he was born toward the end of the year and he's in soccer language, U5, under 5. He loves the game, and he's a nifty, gentle little boy. And the coach, I think, is probably great. I've never met him, but he raises his voice at the boys. He hollers. I don't think in anger. I think he may even holler, "Way to go." But my grandson has to take a few moments to get away from that, because he just has never really been yelled at. And my son, his dad, watches this and thinks, okay, we got to toughen this kid up. Like, what's the deal here? How do we deal with that? And good on them, because I don't know how to deal with that. After coaching soccer for 30 years and yelling myself hoarse more times than I care to imagine. But this notion of you enter a discipline, and the discipline requires that you, for want of a better phrase, toughen yourself up. Don't expect facilitative language in this discipline. We don't do that. Get over it. Get back to work. Well, there's a part of me that kind of likes the soccer coach that says that to some players who say, but he pushed me. Well, in a science discipline, that may very well be part of the culture, and I'm actually not about to be critical of that as a person who exists both within a culture like that, because medical research has, and reviews of medical research can be blunt. So if chemistry, physics, engineering, any of the science fields or any other field wishes to continue with the tone that is normative within their disciplines, it's not my place to tell them not to. But one of the points I wanted to make at the very beginning of our session together was, we're different, for better or for worse. We are very diverse. We've got people sticking toes in the water all over the place. We've got people trying to figure out one another who are sitting beside each other. So maybe we could take the risk of saying, look, you come from disciplines where you just had thick skin, now get thick skin now. But I don't think that works for the things we're trying to learn and pursue and build in a discipline that's so diverse, in particular in disciplinary terms, but in more terms than that. So fine, that's good, but boy, if I had a loony for every time a colleague came up to me at this conference, or perhaps a Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed conference, or a POD conference, or a HIRDSA conference, or other conferences, and said, I got to tell you, I go to a lot of, now you fill in the blank, psychology, history, chemistry conferences. They're not like this. And the person's a little disoriented. Like, what is this? What are the norms here? And I'm so proud of that, and a little mischievous about that too. So yeah, thank you for that question. I hope it allowed me to clarify that I'm not trying to lord over other disciplines. They will do what they do. They will change the world the way they change the world. There's a bunch of others. I'm also keeping an eye on the clock for folks, because there are people who have plans. But here we go, please, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to encourage you to go a little deeper than that. And what is different about this discipline than, say, physics, my discipline, or another another discipline that is long established, okay? And we're really in a formation phase, it seems to me, and that's part of the challenge. We're in that formation phase, and if we look at any of our other disciplines, and I can look at the history of general relativity that really crystallized in the 1950s because it wasn't sufficiently connected. And so the idea that any discipline is uniformly a solid, all the norms are set, is just probably not an accurate decision. But every place that people are trying to build something fundamentally new, you have to engage in the kind of facilitation that you do. And SOTL is such a field. I think that's been emphasized several times here. And I thought that was where you were going to go, but you didn't.
No, I
so
didn't.
Comment, please.
Yeah, well, that's a very good insight. You know, there's this lovely, straightforward phenomenon in psychology where two groups exist, and you belong to one, and you don't belong to the other. And for the person who belongs to the first group, two things tend to happen. They overestimate the similarity among the people within their group, and they overestimate the similarity among the people who are in the other group, and they overestimate the distance between the two. And I think I was probably guilty of that. Disciplines have norms, I believe that. They do get challenged to a point. I had a chance in our own physics department at UBC to talk with folks at some length when we were considering, and then were lucky enough to actually achieve bringing Carl Wyman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, to our university to work on science education. And boy, there were some interesting conversations in the physics department then. And again, that mischievous side of me was very happy to see those conversations happen. It would have been unfair to label my physics colleagues as being unable to see where Carl wanted to go and why. It would have been fair, however, to say that for many of them, it was difficult. And in fact, they would have said so. So, yeah, thank you for that. Last question. Thank you, Nancy. We got somebody with a...
Gary?
Please, yeah.
Thank you, Gary. Really inspiring again. And my question, I suppose, deals with the subtlety of SOTL in the sense of the space in which these questions happen, and whether a conference of this nature is one that helps to facilitate or hinder the growth of SOTL in the sense of who speaks, who's heard, and who reaches out, and does the learning actually occur more in the informal as opposed to the formal?
But that last point, you know, formal versus informal settings, I think it's very possible that we get more done informally. It's kind of maybe the way we are, and it harkens back to the notion of those small significant networks. Alice Cassidy and I once talked about this when we were talking about conference pedagogy, and we had a dream that one day we would actually be able to do a plenary where we came in, stood up and said, talk among yourselves. And, you know, I think we've all been in sessions, and maybe even plenary sessions, I have, where the person with all good intentions gave us a task to do, and then we just did what we wanted. And it was great. And we just sort of hoped that the person on the stage didn't say, what were you talking about? Yeah, absolutely so. Absolutely so. I think our students also, you know, learn and inform, and we're designing our learning spaces differently as a result. Okay, the evening moves on. The snow may be falling. It's always a privilege to be able to get up in front of you folks. Thanks so much.